Hi everyone, this is a short screencast for Independent Colleges Dublin covering the area of corporate governance and its development. Now, the first thing to do here is really to define what corporate governance is, and essentially it's the way in which a given entity is directed, managed and controlled. And the development of corporate governance in the main has been caused by the number of corporate scandals that we have had both in the UK and indeed Ireland and elsewhere over the last 20 years or so. Particularly you could mention Enron and the Robert Maxwell Mirror Group scandal and indeed a variety of others. So really what the regulators are trying to do here is to set out a blueprint for companies to be managed correctly. And really what listed companies in particular, because it's a requirement for them, need to do is that they need to comply with the guidelines that have been set out. Now, typically in an E-stream question on corporate governance, what you'll find is that the examiner, whether it's E1 or E2 or indeed E3, will set out a series of problems perhaps in a given scenario. And those problems would be in these sorts of areas. So I've just highlighted a few for you. You know, one of the first ones, and that's certainly relevant to Robert Maxwell and the Mirror Group in the early 90s, is just the domination of the company by a single individual. And the phrase that you would probably refer to there is this idea of unfettered powers. And that's certainly what Robert Maxwell will have had. And really what the regulators don't want is for one individual to be so powerful as to dominate a company. So one of the things that they require is a separation of the CEO and chairman duties. Over and above that, you'll see that things like the board involvement, you know, having a strong and effective, powerful board is important for an entity to enable it to sort of manage itself well. You know, other issues here linked to the board, this idea of sort of independence or independent scrutiny. And what you'll see coming in there within questions is this issue of non-executive directors. And so what are they? And they're really just directors who are in the main paid, who will provide some sort of independence for the company if they're sitting on the board or indeed on committees. Another point here is just this idea of short-termism. In other words, that this being a problem for companies where they're only looking in the short term as opposed to, let's say, medium or long term in terms of their profit take. Okay. In terms of other areas, really, I guess outside of a scenario detailing a set of problems, you know, what the E1 examiner would want you to do is just to have a reasonable feel for what is considered to be sort of good practice. In other words, what is laid down in the main, perhaps UK code, although you could also refer to perhaps the rules-based code or the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the States. But for our purposes here, if we concentrate on the corporate, the UK code, what you'll find is that the development of the UK code really commenced in the sort of early 90s after the Mirror Group scandal with Robert Maxwell. And throughout that time, from sort of 92 onwards, what you'll find is a series of reports that developed the code over time. And the latest UK code would be dated in 2010, June 2010. And really what the code does, as I've mentioned above, is just really lay out a set of guidelines. And although these guidelines are not in legislation, in other words, they are not rules, what we're required to do as entities within the UK, particularly listed companies, entities, as I mentioned above, is to adhere to them. And if these guidelines are not adhered to, then the any departures have to be detailed and disclosed and indeed explained within the company accounts of the annual reports. So really all companies are encouraged to practice good corporate governance and to adhere to the guidelines, although just bear in mind that they are not enshrined in legislation, certainly not in the UK. Okay. Now, in terms of the main principles, and these are important, these are the sorts of areas that you really need to rote learn. As I've mentioned above, one of the key principles is this idea of leadership. So that will come from an effective and indeed a balanced board. So without a balanced board, it's unlikely that the individual entity will be directed and managed and controlled well. Okay. Linked into that is this idea of effectiveness, and obviously for effectiveness, that's going to be relevant to the people on the board. So really what we need is a balance of skills and experience, and indeed independence, and that will come from NEDs or non-executive directors. Other points that are relevant here, things like remuneration, and there's really two sides to the remuneration. Certainly it should be sufficient to attract the right caliber of people, but preferably it should be linked in some way to performance. Okay, so we mentioned above this idea of short-termism, and really what that means is perhaps linking remuneration to short-term profit, and that's seen as being not conducive to the sort of long-term success of the company, and also to directors and managers really managing the company's resources effectively for the various stakeholders, including shareholders. Okay. Last point here is just in relation to sort of communications. Good communications with shareholders are important. After all, they are the owners of the country of the company. Okay, so really that's a very brief intro to corporate governance. This is an important topic within the eStream. I think the first thing, as I've mentioned, is just get that fix on the definition, what it is. The scenarios that you may see if it's a Section C style question, I would expect would be, include one or two of these items here. And I think the last point is just really what is good corporate governance, and that would be just really the key principles here of the code in terms of effectiveness of the board, separation of powers, NEDs, and various committees, including the Remuneration Committee and indeed the Audit Committee. So hopefully that's been of help, and good luck with your studies.